as part of the Tri-State SARE Professional Development Project, which is funded through the USDA and Northeast SARE. It's a collaborative project among the universities of Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. We are in our second year of a 3-year project, and we're continuing our efforts this year on pasture-based systems for sustainable.
Have closed for the fall, and those contracts are going to be starting fairly soon as well too. We also have graduate student grants there up to a level of $15,000. The partnership grants are also listed. Those are up to $30,000, and again, that was where someone an ag service provider could be working with a farmer on an idea as well too. Just something of note: these are not matching grants. These are grants that are made and don't require a match from the applicant, etc. Other kinds of grants that are available are research and education, research for novel approaches, professional development, and a new grant opportunity is historically underserved farming communities as well too. And that gives you a sense of the kinds of funding that are available. And the kind of who eligible applicants might be. These are all grants that would be available. The timeline in terms of when the proposals are due are typically listed. When the contracts start as well with duration. If you have any questions regarding any of the SARE grants that are available and eligibility and the kinds of grants that are funded, feel free to reach out to me. My email address will be on our Northeast SARE website as well too. In addition to the grants that Northeast SARE makes available to farmers and ag service providers, they also have a wealth of resource information as well too on a variety of topics. For example, if you're interested in a particular idea on your farm or working with a farmer on a project, Northeast SARE provides a great resource in terms of the kinds of research that's been done in the past. You can get a sense of really what's been done, how it's been done, and some of the results of the research been done as well. The SARE also has grants programs throughout the country, so some folks do too. They may have a kind of a farming practice that was maybe done out maybe in the Southwest or the far West, and maybe a matter of, gee, can I use that kind of farming practice here in the Northeast? So it may be simply taking an idea for a project, maybe another part of the country, and kind of bringing it to the Northeast and determining, whether or not that idea would be effective here in the Northeast. Another requirement of SARE, basically, which I applaud, is that one of the requirements of the grants is that the data, the information, the results of the grant is shared with all as well too. So again, there's a wealth of information where other researchers and farmers have shared the results of their hard work and their projects as well. The last thing I'll say is that Northeast SARE, in addition to grants and grant information and grant research, they have a lot of publications, bulletins, booklets on a variety of topics as well too, including livestock and livestock resiliency. Many of their publications are available online as free as PDFs, and some of the material can be available to be sent to you free, or generally speaking, there may be a fee for anything you have sent to you as well too. But again, a lot of the materials available online as free PDFs. Again, if you're looking to have something sent to you, a hard copy, again, some of those may be a fee to have that sent to you as well too. Again, any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is on the website that Rachel referenced. And without further ado, I'll turn the program back over to you, Rachel, and thank you and welcome to everyone. And it looks like it's going to be a great program today. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, I just wanted to thank our speakers for joining us today and also give them a quick introduction so that everybody knew who they were. We're welcoming Sarah Kelman, the New England Soil Health Specialist for American Farmland Trust. She's driven by a desire to work with farmers of all types toward improved farm resilience in the face of a changing climate. She has been a fellow with the USDA Northeast Climate Hub, running peer-to-peer climate-focused programs for farmers and service providers, and received an MS in Plant, Soil, and Environmental Science from the University of Maine in 2021. Sarah has worked on vegetable and cut flower farms in Maine and California, and currently lives in the Mid-Coast region of Maine. And we're also welcoming Richard Watson. Richard joined American Farmland Trust in March of 2024. In his role as Senior Regional Health Grazing Specialist, he serves as a primary technical lead on the Climate Smart Beef Project. Prior to joining AFT, Richard was born and raised in New Zealand. After obtaining his PhD there, Richard was employed as a postdoctoral research at the University of Georgia. Since that time, he's held roles as the statewide forage extension specialist at Mississippi State University, and as a senior scientist in the Forage Improvement Group at Ag Research, New Zealand's equivalent to the USDA ARS. In 2007, Richard left academia to develop one of the largest pasture-based dairy farming operations in the US, with 3 large grazing dairies located in southeast Georgia, capable of milking a combined 2,500 cows. He holds a bachelor's and master's degrees in agricultural science and a PhD in animal science with an emphasis on forage technologies and grazing systems management at New Zealand's Massey University. So with that, I thank both Sarah and Richard for being with us today. And I am going to stop sharing my screen so Sarah can start sharing hers. She is going to kick us off today with a presentation titled Changing Weather Patterns and Impacts on Agriculture. Sarah?
Thank you, Rachel.
Looks good. Everything's
Okay, how
ready to
does that
go. Looks good.
Okay. Thank you all for being here and for choosing to spend some time with us this morning. And thank you to Rachel and Tri-State SARE for inviting us here. Happy to be here and hopefully share some useful information with you all. So let's see, there we go. I'm gonna talk for a little while about climate change impacts in New England. And then we're going to do a little breakout session and talk about how you are seeing these impacts on your farms or on the farms that you work with, and then pass it over to Richard. So let's dig in. Part 1, climate change impacts in New England. I always have to, I end up doing this kind of like bummer talk a lot. And so I apologize for the bummer talk, but I promise it's gonna get better, and I hope that you'll leave feeling hopeful and feeling like you're about to spend the rest of these webinars talking about solutions. So first, I just want to quickly run through some fundamentals. So when we talk about climate change, we're talking about the process by which the emissions of greenhouse gases and other processes heat Earth's atmosphere, which in turn raises the average surface temperature of the Earth. So a warmer atmosphere can hold more water, 7% more for every 1 degree increase in temperature. So as we see the temperature rise, we also see an intensification of the Earth's water cycle, which causes uneven precipitation around the world. And some places are going to have more and other places are going to have less. So those changes in temperature and precipitation are linked, and they're the two kind of fundamental primary outcomes of climate change. And they cause the impacts that I have listed here, which we know are going to affect our agricultural systems. So this is extreme weather events, changes in water availability, shifting pests and weed life cycles, wildfire and smoke, and the list kind of goes on. So I'm going to kind of touch on these impacts as I talk. But, you know, this is just a summary of how the change in climate is going to impact our agricultural system. And the other thing I want to say is that I'm mostly going to present historic climate data. So kind of like a wrap up of all of the weather reports that we've had over time. So what I hope is that this is just kind of going to be like a validation of the experiences that you're having from day to day and from year to year, and to show you trends over time to say, like, yes, what you're seeing is actually happening, and here's where we think we're probably going to go. So first, I just want to show you this figure as a way of kind of showing the extent of the problem and turn it into dollars, because dollars is something that I think, you know, it doesn't really matter who you are, money talks. So this is obviously a problem that we're going to have to solve. So we're seeing a dramatic increase in the number of billion-dollar disasters across the country, and all of these natural disasters impact farms. So first, we're going to talk about temperature. So since 1901, the average surface temperature across the contiguous 48 states has risen at an average of 0.17 degrees Fahrenheit per decade. That's an average, though. And if you look at this map, you can see that some regions, including New England, are warming faster than others. So the dark red colors show an increased temperature of between 2 and 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit since the beginning of the 20th century. So switching now to focus on New England, you can see that warming is happening kind of unevenly in our region, with some parts of New England experiencing actually very little warming thus far, although that's really more true in like New York and central Pennsylvania. And this is a good reminder that even within our region, there's variability in how we're going to experience climate change. And another thing to note is you can kind of see along the coast that warming is happening a lot faster. So, and that's probably because our coastal waters are warming at a faster rate than any other ocean temperatures in the world. And that's probably contributing to increased land surface temperature. So shifting now to talk about the figure on the right, normally when we talk about climate data, we're talking about averages over about 30 years, sometimes longer. This chart is showing that in the past 50 years, we're seeing kind of a dramatic upward trend in the average annual temperature in the Northeast. So before, I told you the average since 1901 was 0.17 degrees per decade. And since 1970, the rates across the whole country have doubled, and in some places tripled. And you're seeing kind of that more dramatic increase on this figure here, which is just in the Northeast. And this is because Earth's systems move pretty slowly. So we're still experiencing changes associated with greenhouse gases that were emitted kind of a long time ago. So when we think about the greenhouse gases that we're emitting today and next year, we're going to experience the effects of that down the line in the future. This is just another way to look at kind of the same data. The dotted line in the middle is the average. Red lines indicate above average. Blue lines indicate below average. So you're just seeing more time spent above the average since around 1970, 1980. And temperatures aren't increasing uniformly across all seasons. So I think generally when we think about climate change, we think about summer heat waves, which is certainly a part of it, but we're actually seeing a more dramatic increase in temperatures between December and March. So for me, when I see this, I think about especially how this is going to impact us with snow and how we're going to have to think differently about our production systems and how we manage water when more of our precipitation is falling as rain instead of snow, and we have less consistent freezing in the winter. So you can see that in many areas of the country, winter warming is greater than the average of 2.1 degrees Fahrenheit. And in the Northeast kind of part of the country, the average temperature has risen in the wintertime somewhere between 3 and 6 degrees since 1970. And then the figure on the right just kind of shows this data in a different way. This is from Millinocket, Maine, but the point basically is that along the bottom, you can see the abbreviations for each month, starting with January and running through December. And on the y-axis, you can see the temperature change per decade. And so you can really see the more dramatic increases in temperature in the winter months. Okay, so we talked about seasonal variability, but what about within a day? So we're seeing both more warm days and warm nights, but the daily minimum temperatures are increasing faster than the daily maximum temperatures, which basically means that the nighttime lows have increased, and this is especially true in the winter. And one thing I think is really important to think about and to mention in relation to warming night temperatures is the effect that it has on livestock. So we all know that livestock rely on cool nights to kind of thermoregulate. So this just makes me think about the impact of not being able to cool off during the night, especially during the summer. And I tried to kind of pick out like data from different states that I think are represented in the audience today. So this is Rhode Island, but the trend kind of stands across New England. And again, the black line here is the average, and you can kind of see the interannual variation, but you can see the trend line going up over time. So we think, you know, warmer for longer. So we can think about how that might affect the first and last frost date. And what we're seeing here is that overall, in the last 125, 26 years, the growing season in the Northeast has increased by 14 days on average. So I think it's a little bit maybe of a misnomer to say that the growing season has increased. It's just the period of time between the last and first frost has increased, but what you're actually able to do with those extra days depends a lot on if it's happening in the early season and, you know, how much precipitation you've been getting, how muddy the ground might be, versus like maybe if it's happening later in the fall end of the season, that might actually be time that you might be able to use a little bit more efficiently. And this tool on the right just shows at the county level the change in free states. So dark orange is +5 or more days and dark blue is -5. So this is on a decade-long trend and shows kind of by county, which is always, you know, a little bit more granular and a little bit more interesting maybe than just looking at the state data. So another way we're experiencing shifting temperature dynamics is the warming average annual minimum temperature, which is how we calculate plant hardiness zones. So if you're a perennial nerd, thinking about shifting plant hardiness zones might be something that you were really excited about when this new USDA map was released. And what this shows is that since 2012, about 50% of the country has shifted into the next warmer half zone. So meaning if plants that were rated to say 8A before, you can now plant a species that could survive 8B. So here you can kind of just see the difference between 2012 and 2023. And what I think is interesting about this is that we're seeing the cooler regions move both geographically north and topographically up. So like higher elevation places are losing those colder zones both north and up. And then talking about hot a little bit here. So it's gonna get warmer. We're gonna have more warm days. And it's also it kind of stays more humid. So this is a tool for looking at the temperature humidity index for dairy cows. So yellow is mild stress, orange is moderate stress, red is severe risk of heat stress. And you can find these tools for all different kinds of livestock. But I just think it's interesting to think about, like, if the humidity isn't decreasing, especially overnight, and the temperature is staying higher, you can use this tool to see the level of stress that you might expect to anticipate in your livestock. And this is also, this is good for livestock. It's also good for humans, thinking about farm worker health and safety. So to summarize temperature, we've already seen a 3-degree increase since around 1900, and we're projected to experience another 5 to 11-degree increase in temperature by 2099. Winters are warming faster than other seasons, but the degree to which this is true is kind of spatially variable. We're seeing longer frost-free periods, which may or may not mean a longer growing season, depending on the precipitation conditions, aka mud. And finally, we're seeing more hot days, more heat waves, and more warm nights. Okay, switching now to precipitation. So, as I said earlier, climate change is intensifying the Earth's water cycle. So wet areas of the country are becoming wetter and drier areas are becoming drier. And part of this has to do with the fact that a warmer atmosphere holds more water. So 7% more for every 1 degree increase in temperature. So just like a bigger bucket can hold and dump more water, a warmer atmosphere can hold more water vapor and therefore dump more water when it rains, basically. So we can look at the same kind of trends when it comes to rainfall. In the chart on the left, you can see the trends in precipitation in the Northeast between June and August by year. So again, we're looking at 1895 to 2023. And the gray line is the average. And again, that blue line is just 1960 through 2022. And you can see that there's a pretty big increase in the amount of rainfall. So it's an increase of 0.44 inches per decade. And another way to look at this is the map on the right. Darker shades of green indicate increases in annual rainfall, and kind of beige indicates a decrease in annual rainfall. And in southern New England, we're seeing precipitation increases between 2 and 20% since 1901. So in a nutshell, wet areas are becoming wetter, dry areas are becoming drier. And another thing I want to highlight about these changing precipitation patterns is that in the Northeast, the percentage of rainfall events that are classified as heavy events is increasing. And what this figure is showing is that we're getting more of our precipitation, 38% more than in 1901, in the heaviest 1% of storms. So this especially probably comes as no surprise. We've seen these gigantic storms, these really heavy rain events in the past few years. And, this data is kind of backing that up. And this is the same thing on a little bit more of a granular scale. So each of these dots represents a weather station. And what we're looking at here is the probability of essentially a really big storm happening as compared to the probability of that same really big storm happening in 2000. So dark green is a 125% chance compared to 2000, and brown is a less than 76% chance, and yellow is right around 100, or the same level. So you can really see the variability here, even within our region. And I kind of just zoomed in a little bit more so you can see that, even within a state, the chance of receiving one of these really, really big storms isn't the same, no matter where you are. Another thing that I wanted to point out, after I've just spent so much time talking about how much more precipitation we're going to get, is the fact that just because on average we're getting more doesn't mean it's going to happen every year. So this figure shows dry and wet conditions in Massachusetts since 1895. And I'm showing you this to kind of exhibit that, well, on the right side, you can see there's more of these dark blue years happening more often. We're also still getting drought years, so the kind of warmer colors. So this means managing for both extremes. And even though the trend is towards the kind of wetter years, we're still getting those super droughty years in there as well. So drought with more precipitation, probably. One thing to think about with these really big storms and getting more precipitation in these really big storms is that what that probably means is these dry periods in between where it's going to be warmer, it's going to be dry, plants will have, and animals will have an increased water demand. So their demand for water might kind of outweigh the amount of precipitation that's happening in that period of time, which might lead to forage yield and quality decreases. Maybe you're going to need more water on hand, and you might still need to think about how you're managing your water overall if we're getting a lot and then none and then a lot. And what this might look like, what this probably will look like, is thinking more about early wet seasons and dry late seasons. So summarizing precipitation here, we're seeing an overall increase in precipitation in our region. The extent of the increase is pretty geographically dynamic, but across the region, we're getting more precipitation and more of it is falling in the heaviest storms. What this also means is that we're seeing more periods of dryness between rain events, which can sometimes set us up for drought conditions in spite of more rain. Where did this data come from? And can you look at it by yourself? Absolutely, yes. There are a couple of places that I recommend if you're interested in looking more specifically at your climate data. So one place to look is the NOAA State Climate Summaries. They're really nice little 4-page fact sheets. We also have the NOAA Climate Monitoring National Centers for Environmental Information. That's where a lot of the figures in this presentation came from. And then the 5th National Climate Assessment, which came out last year. 750 scientists worked on it. It's kind of gigantic, but there are chapters on agriculture and chapters for each region, so you can kind of hone in on what you want to look at. And that's that for me. So I am going to stop sharing and see if there are any questions.
Anybody? Oh, sorry. If anybody has any questions, you can feel free to post them in the chat so that we're not all speaking up at once. But this would be a good time to get some general climate questions addressed before we head into our breakout sessions. I'll be sure to share those resources too that Sarah had in the last couple slides with you all moving forward. So don't worry if you didn't get it all jotted down while she was talking. There's some questions, Sarah.
I see. Okay. All right. So, Jaime is asking, how is it that, hang on, chat just disappeared. Let me get it back. How is it that droughts will increase when there's more rainfall? Yeah. So, I think it kind of, so the data doesn't actually show that droughts are going to increase. Or decrease really, but I think the thing there's the way that drought is defined, there are, there's hydrologic drought, there's agricultural drought, and then there's also, just like when it's really dry and you can tell that plants need more water, and that's not actually technically defined as drought, but that's, I think, maybe the most interesting thing to look at. And yes, there's going to be more precipitation overall, but because it's going to be happening more of it is going to be happening in these really big events, and it's not going to be like nice, gentle rain and snow throughout the year, but instead these kind of like big dumps and then maybe dry periods in the middle. That might not actually register as hydrologic or agricultural drought, but it still will kind of have the same impact as drought, which is that you might not have enough water exactly when you need it. I don't know, Jaime, if that answers your question. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask me if you want more follow-up on that. And then the next question is there any danger that this data will become unavailable during this administration? Yes. Yeah, that's definitely possible. I, for one, am kind of stockpiling some of it just in case. But who knows, you know.
Any other questions before we head to our breakout rooms? I am going to turn it over to Richard, who is going to give us a presentation that talks a little bit about how all of this change impacts grazing and what does that mean during extreme conditions. So Richard, as I will hand it over to you if you wanted to start sharing your screen, and go from there.
Hopefully it's not too repetitive for the people who are involved in that session. So I'm going to try to take some of the very high level data that Sarah highlighted in her presentation and try to apply that in a more sort of focused context on grazing management systems, and really talk about things we can do regardless of how big or small your farm is, or whether you have sheep or dairy cows or beef cows. The basic principles or the fundamental principles are kind of the same, and you know, just really delivering decision making tools that will enable hopefully to deal with extreme weather events and improve your system overall, because the fundamentals are the same. It's important to really consider what impacts and how climate change will manifest itself in our grazing management systems. You know, we've talked at a very high level about some of the trends, whether it's warming. Obviously, warming has impacts on forage production. Different plants grow better at different temperatures. There's this concept of growing degree days. Some of the cool season grasses that are used in the northeast really stop growing at about 85 to 90 degrees. So if you have a warming climate, what impact does that have on overall forage production when that plant's growing and the adaptation of that species in your environment? We've talked about differences in rain and snowfall patterns, obviously impacts forage production. Are we going to get more extremes? Certainly in the southeast where I am, we've had two rather extreme events, more extreme events in the last 6 months, with a large hurricane and then a snowfall event, which is, I was sharing my anecdote about the weather person on the station saying we're never going to see this for another 100 years because it was a 100-year snowfall event. Well, I don't know that we can say that anymore. We've kind of tossed out what the definition of 100-year event is by these recent events. Then you've got biotic stress that was measured, warmer environments, more humidity, changes in the cycling of air movement on the planet brings in more disease, more pests. We're getting more viruses, more fungal diseases, different pests that are invading from different parts of the world based on climate change. In reality, it's really all of the above. All these things will ultimately have some impact to a greater or lesser extent, and we need to be ready for it. There's also, you know, climate change is not a good thing at all, but are all these impacts going to be negative? Where I come from in New Zealand, where forage utilisation and pasture utilisation forms the basis of all livestock agriculture, there has been some discussion about, well, does a warming climate with more CO2 in the atmosphere actually improve forage production and plant production? So are there some unintended positives that climate change will have on pasture production and overall productivity on farms? As of yet, they haven't seen any increase. In fact, over the last 20 years, pasture productivity has stayed about the same. So right now, any sort of positive impacts that may or may not be something that happens in the future are not happening now. But either way, the farmer, the forage, and the livestock need to recognise and adapt and then plan to this change. That's really the fundamental of this discussion, is what can we do to recognise what's going on and then formulate plans to try to manage and adapt to it. If you look at, again, Sarah shared the graph that showed sort of by season and by north to south latitude, the planting zones for the United States. What I've done is I've put it into more of a grass forage-based context for you to show what grasses dominate different parts of the country. Don't take these lines too literally. Obviously, there's an overlap, and your cool season grasses do encroach further south, and likewise Bermuda grass and warm season grasses do grow all the way up into Canada. So you can find Bermuda grass in Canada. You will not find perennial ryegrass and orchard grass far south of the Piedmont in the mountains. But just to create some context, you know, in the northeast, you're mostly dealing with these temperate or cool season grasses like perennial ryegrass, orchard grass. You might have a little bit of fescue. Then you get further south into the mid-south. Tall fescue is also a cool season grass, but typically will tolerate a lot more heat than say these other cool season grasses. And then you get into the deep south, and really you're dominated by these warm season grasses that grow during the summer and are dormant during the winter. And one of the reasons I put this up here is that as climate changes, what are we going to see? Are we going to see, whether deliberately or inadvertently, use of different forage species as the climate warms in the north? Are we going to see more Bermuda grass used in the mid-Atlantic or even further north? Are we going to see our utility of ryegrass and orchard grass decreasing in the northeast as it becomes less adapted to that heat? As I said, you start getting over 85, 90 degrees, and a lot of these cool season grasses will shut down. At what point do they not grow at all? So these are all things that we need to consider in developing a forage system that's more resilient to climate change. Do we need to use different grasses? Of course, there are more than just grasses. I've used grasses as an example because grasses are the most predominant pasture species. And the reason they are is because they're the most tolerant of grazing. They have a meristem or a growing point that's in the ground. Most of the world's forages or forage lands are in grass, and they make up 70% of the world's agricultural land. So yes, we should be promoting diversity in clovers and forbs and some other things I'll talk about, but by and large, our grasslands and forage lands are dominated by these grass species. So the big problem really is seasonality of growth. We don't have a growth problem as such in the United States. We actually grow a lot of grass per unit area. The problem really is utilization. We don't really have efficient systems that utilize most of the grass that can be grown. If you think that the average sort of per acre production in dry matter terms of most cool season grasses in a normal year, whatever that is probably at least 10,000 pounds of dry matter per acre. The average cow eats about 10,000 pounds of dry matter per acre. So you could make the argument, well, we grow 10,000 pounds, a cow eats 10,000 pounds, we should be able to run a cow per acre. Well, of course, that doesn't happen in reality. Typically, stocking rates are somewhere between 1 cow to 3 to 4 acres, depending where you are and what forage system you use. So you could make the assumption that we're really only harvesting somewhere between 50 and 20% of the growth potential of that grass. And the reason we're doing that is because of the seasonality of growth. We have peaks and troughs. We have periods of the year where we're growing a lot of grass that exceeds the demand of the cow, and then we have parts of the year that are below the cow's demand. So we typically have to stock to those troughs, to those low points, in order to maintain the cow, and then of course feed supplementary feeds. So how will climate change alter these peaks? Will it flatten out some of the spring growth? Will it improve our winter growth? Will it depress our summer growth? So these curves are ultimately going to change depending on climate change and rainfall patterns and things like that. And really the key here is what is measured is managed. We need to be able to manage we need to be able to measure these effects on forage. We need to measure our forage from in the first instance for our production system. If we don't know what we're growing, we can't help to utilize it. So if I overlay animal demand over that, and this is quite an aggressive stocking rate, it's actually probably a lot less than this. So the brown curve here is if you are overlaying animal demand across that forage production, you can see the peaks and troughs. You can see here in the spring and early summer, we have this massive oversupply that needs to be managed. And then later on in the summer, as the grass starts to go dormant, as the heat increases, we get a trough, or we get a forage deficit. So in an ideal situation, these two lines would match each other, and the amount of forage you grow would equal the amount of forage you graze. But of course, that doesn't happen. Livestock can be seasonal too, depending on what type of livestock, your stocking rate, whether they're lactating. But this is where the key of the problem is, where the utilization issue occurs, is we just have these peaks and troughs that need to be managed. And that could be exacerbated in a climate change environment where the peaks and troughs get bigger or change where they are in the production cycle of that plant. And these problems are even greater in a continuously grazed system where you can't control how much the animal eats and when the animal eats. So obviously grazing management is key to all of this. Grazing management is a crop management tool. Yes, the fence is there to keep the animal where you want them, but ultimately grazing management is a crop management tool. It is there to optimize the growth of the plant, the quality of the plant, how much the animal eats or harvests. It's a harvest management tool. And the main goal is there to control the time and frequency of grazing, of harvest. You're controlling the harvest of that plant to optimize the yield and quality of that plant to meet the animal's demand. The importance of harvest management. So we've got an overgrazing situation to an undergrazing situation. So rotational grazing or grazing management is really trying to keep that plant in its optimum growth stage. The key here is grass grows grass. If you don't have those solar panels and you overgraze the plant, its recovery and overall forage yield will be less than if you leave some leaf for it to grow back from. So moving the animal before overgrazing occurs is key in not just maintaining the quality, but it's also helps with the yield. And as you can see, yield goes up as leaf area goes up. But you can also get into an overgraze situation and let the plant grow too tall, and you get lignification and you get loss of nutrient quality in that plant. So keeping the plant in an optimum stage of growth where the quality is optimized and the yield is optimized, so you get better regrowth and better qualitative aspects in that plant, is really key, or the ultimate goal of grazing management. Again, you've got some growth cycle here. Shoot and root mass are directly related. So the more grass you leave behind, the more root you grow, the better the health of the plant, the better the plant can withstand climate extremes. It grows back quicker, it recovers quicker. Again, overgrazing being the enemy here. Really grazing management, if you're going to concentrate on anything, it's not overgrazing that plant to improve growth in the leaf to shoot ratio. So rotational grazing, many of you probably already do it, or at least familiar with it. As the name implies, it's rotating animals around paddocks or fields. And The number of fields can vary from 2 to as many as you want. On our dairy farms, we have up to 50 on each farm. So it's really just rotating animals through these fields on some sort of time and area decision-making process. So usually during periods of high growth, you speed up the rotation to try and accommodate the grass that's growing fast. And likewise, when the periods of growth are low, you try to slow it down so you don't use up all your forage. And as I mentioned before, rotational grazing allows control over forage deficits, prevent overgrazing. So what we do, the counterintuitive piece here is that I say during periods of slow growth, you try to slow the rotation down. You would think, well, okay, that's going to increase my chance of overgrazing. The difference there is that you would actually be putting supplementary feed in at that time as well. So you can control overgrazing by feeding hay or some other supplementary feed that reduces the animal's propensity to graze the pasture down. And meanwhile, you're growing more grass in front of you and preserving what grass you have available to you. A good way to think about it is like if you were on a desert island and had a finite amount of food, you wouldn't eat all that food on day one, otherwise you would starve. It's better to try and ration out that food over a period of time to ensure that you live longer. And the same applies to grass, having grass available for longer and putting supplementary feed in earlier and at smaller amounts to slow that rotation down. You ultimately will end up feeding less supplement that way than using all your grass and going to 100% supplementation. Metering it out and using it to stretch out the grazing is better than grazing all the grass and then using all supplement. Rotational grazing also allows you to control surplus. So at times when grass supply is greater than animal demand, you can actually cut areas out of the rotation if you have the land available and if you have the equipment. I understand smaller farmers don't always have that ability to separate out areas and make hay, but it is a management tool to reduce the area that the animals graze and increase stocking rate on a smaller area of the farm to manage forage growth and manage forage quality, and then take any surplus, make hay out of it or make silage out of it, and then feed that back during times of deficit. I've used a very simplistic way of representing grazing management, and in reality, grazing management and rotational grazing is not actually a rotation. It's a rotation to the extent that you're going in a sequence through paddocks or through fields based on forage availability, but grazing should really be based on pasture readiness, not in some sort of sequential order from however you number your fields. So these are where decision-making tools come in. So managing the rotation, really what you need to be able to do is measure pasture mass and then calculate what the pasture mass is in that field, and then create this wedge, which is really an inventory of your grass from paddock 1 through to paddock 6. And then you can allocate the fields in order of how much grass they have and try to achieve the targets that you set for yourself. So you should always be setting targets for yourself. How much grass do I want to give the animal? That relies on how much grass is there and how much grass do I want to leave behind. And then you want to review that plan. And then you can try to match supply and demand. You know how much grass your animals are eating. If you know how much grass you're growing, month by month, you can create a supply and demand curve that says, okay, I'm growing this much grass, my animals need this much grass, and you can start to identify where you have surpluses and deficits. But you need to be able to measure it in the first place. And once you can identify these surpluses and deficits, then you can determine how much supplementary feeding you need to do, how many stock you can carry. Do you need to destock? Can you afford to put more stock on? But it will also put you in a position that when you do get a weather extreme event or some change resulting from climate change, you can forecast out how you might manage your way through it. How much extra supplementation do you have to have on hand? For example, if your pasture production goes from 100 pounds of dry matter per day down to 50 pounds of dry matter per day in the spring. So it is also a planning tool that you can run sensitivities around. Also, we talked about the animal. Environmental impacts voluntary food intake. The last thing an animal feels like doing when it's heat stressed and hot is eating grass. They want to seek shade, they want to seek cooling. So it's important that we think about the animal, or whether our animal is adapted to the environment. In the breakout session, we talked about the type of breed of sheep that one particular producer had. And while we don't want to completely throw our whole system out of, we do need to think about whether our genetics is appropriate for the type of system we're running. Do we need to go with a smaller animal that can handle heat better? Do we need to go with a completely different breed? Do we need to mix species? Do we need to integrate cattle into our sheep system or sheep into our cattle system to make better use of our resources? So I mentioned measuring dry matter intake, measuring dry matter, and that's sometimes seems a lot more scary than it really is, but you have to do it in order to get an assessment of how much you're growing and determine what your inventory is. You don't necessarily need a lab to do it. You can do quadrant cuts and you can send them into a lab and get them dried, and they'll tell you what the forage density per unit area is. But there are a lot of really good indirect assessment methods now, or rising or falling plate meters, forage sticks, and your eye is actually a very good one if you can calibrate it and train it to look at forages and say, okay, there's about 2,000 or 3,000 pounds of dry matter per acre there, and I want to leave 1,000 behind, or I want to leave 1,500 behind. Therefore, it gives me 1,000 or 1,500 pounds of dry matter that I can allocate per acre, then I can allocate to my animals and maintain my targets. These are some examples. These are rising or falling plate meters. They were developed in New Zealand. There are some calibrations for cool season grasses like Bermuda grass, perennial ryegrass, even fescue. But if you're using species that aren't typically or don't have a calibration equation for, like a lot of the C4 grasses, Bermuda grass or annual grasses, it becomes more difficult. There are forage sticks that the NRCS put out that do give some rough estimate, and maybe that's all you need, just a rough guide, but at least you're measuring something. You know how much grass you're growing, how much grass you have on hand, and that gives you the tools you need to plan and plan your rotation and what field your animals are going to, and not overgraze and not undergraze. That's really what we're trying to achieve here. Some books have some rough guidelines. I wouldn't take them, necessarily at face value, but I think they can be used to train your eye and to verify and to, develop decision-making tools. Obviously, there's some variation. If you take, let's take orchard grass, for example, that has an average 180 pounds of dry matter per inch per acre. So if you're measuring, 4 inches of growth, you're roughly getting close to 800 pounds of dry matter. But that range can be anywhere from 75 to 300. So you kind of have to use your common sense and say, how thick is my pasture? Is my pasture, all orchard grass, or are there weeds in it, or is there clover in it? So that you kind of have to calibrate your eye and calibrate your thoughts a little bit. But these are useful. Information is out there. You can also go to your extension service in your states, the universities, or NRCS, and I'm sure they'll be able to help you do this as well. This was taken from Southern Forages by Ball, Hovland, and Lacefield. And really, ultimately what you want to do is develop these supply-demand curves and just see how well your system is suited from a forage production and an animal utilization standpoint. I put this one here because you can also get forage tests done and break it down to TDN, break it down to actual digestible nutrients, not just dry matter, if you really want to get super efficient at it. And crude protein is another one. So dry matter is the number one nutritive qualitative measurement, but pine trees are dry matter, but you wouldn't try and feed pine trees to cattle. So obviously energy and protein and doing regular forage tests is a component of this budgeting process that I'm talking about. Rotational grazing can be very basic too. Again, we've got different farm sizes, different livestock classes, different land availability, access to shade, access to water are all critical elements in trying to decide how to do a rotation and how many paddocks you should have. But you can actually achieve a lot just by cutting one field in half to try and avoid overgrazing and get better forage growth, better forage quality. It might mean you have to use more supplementary feeding to slow that round down with only 2 fields, but a 2-field system is vastly more productive and more efficient than continuous grazing. We are always going to get overgrazing and you're always going to get undergrazing, which sounds ridiculous, but that's the truth. You're as they say, a broken clock is right at least twice a day. Well, that's kind of what continuous grazing is. You have 1 or 2 periods during the year where you've got it right, but the rest of the year it's wrong. And the only way to correct the clock is to have some sort of rotational grazing and forage management. Other ways that we can change the forage growth curve is using multi-species systems, is incorporating legumes. Most of the common legumes have similar growth profiles to their cool season grasses. So white clover, red clover typically are the same growth curve as perennial ryegrass and orchard grass, but they will add quality. And they may add overall to dry matter production because they are legumes. They don't require nitrogen fertilizer, so they can add to the growth curve as well. Things like forbs, chicory, plantain are also very good additions to pasture. They have big tap roots, so they can withstand summer heat quite well. They are still cool season forages, and will grow in the cool season as well, but are more summer tolerant. So is alfalfa. You can actually mix alfalfa. There are grazing type alfalfas that can mix with grass, all of which will add quality as well as dry matter production, and make your pastures more resilient to changes, because different grasses grow at different conditions, whether it's rainfall or more drought tolerant or more heat tolerant. You can also approach species diversity as a mixed pasture or mixed sward, or separate out the crops into separate parts of your farm, depending on your soil type and depending on utility. In some ways that's easier because then you can manage the crop to its specific needs. Sometimes it's hard to manage grass and clover mixes because they like different things. Clovers aren't very tolerant of overgrazing. So if you have overgrazing, tight grazing, particularly if you have sheep, the sheep will go in there and they will pick out the clover and leave the grass behind. So management can sometimes be easier if we diversify spatially and put our different crops in different areas. And that also spreads risk. So if one crop's affected by adverse weather or a climate event, hopefully the other crop we have there can withstand it better and we have somewhere to put the animals. I got through that pretty quickly. I had 40 minutes, but excuse me, I wanted to leave enough time for any discussion and questions. That was a reasonable amount to get through, and understanding that every producer and every farmer and every technician has different situations to deal with. So a lot of that hopefully was sort of a generic overall. The key take-home message is measurement, and what is measured is managed. And we need to get more into measuring forage production, measuring pasture production seasonally, and then trying to match it with animal demand, and then implementing a plan, a grazing management plan that makes more efficient use and hopefully tries to match those two curves together. But I'd also like to point out that both Sarah and I are employees at American Farmland Trust, and if you're not familiar with American Farmland Trust, please go to the website. It's farmland.org. Consider joining. We have a very important mission, not just saving land and preserving generational land, but also now into improving efficiency and climate smart production practices. So I would encourage you to see what we do if you don't know about us. And thank you for your time. And I will turn it over for any questions.
Feel free to post questions in the chat as we did at the end of Sarah's presentation. Richard, there's one there now.
So we've got from Jamie. Sorry. Yeah, the question: how do you know when it is the right time to move your animals to the next paddock to avoid overgrazing? So it depends on the species or the forage type that you're using. Really, and in order to do that, you want to set a post-grazing threshold to say, okay, regardless of what happens, I'm not going to graze below this level. For most C3 grasses, it's probably about 4 inches. About 4 inches in length. If you're starting to get below, and I'm not saying you can't graze below 4 inches, but if you start getting below 4 inches of grazing height, you're really starting to remove a lot more leaf than is desirable, and that has two impacts. You're opening up the sward. You're creating more bare space where weeds can come in. You're losing more moisture, and you're reducing the leaf area index by such a point that the regrowth potential of that plant is impacted. And cattle actually below 4 inches, their intake will go down as well. So they just can't physically eat enough. They've got a prehensile tongue. So you get pastures that are too short. And not only does it impact the plant, it also impacts the animal's ability to get a full belly of grass. So it's going to change depending on what type of forages you have. But either get with a technician or someone who can kind of guide you based on what you have to set those minimum standards and then stick to them. Even if you have to feed hay, it's better to pull the animals off that pasture, not overgraze it, and feed some supplementary feed versus leave them on there to overgraze it. So we've got a James question: How can you adjust pasture composition? For instance, if you have overgrowth of less desirable forage, can you adjust the mix of species using grazing, overseeding? Yes, you can. It may require some sort of mechanical harvest if you have that available. I realize not everyone has mowers, not everyone has hay equipment. The other useful mechanism, it can be using a mixed species. So cattle, cattle graze different areas than sheep and can be used to sort of knock down a lot of those undergrazed areas that the sheep will avoid and go and overgraze. So mixing animal species can address that. And a lot of it may be just when you choose to seed or overseed. So making sure that there's soil contact. If you can get hold of a no-till drill, then that's obviously better because seed soil contact is critical. If you have too much canopy there, it makes it very difficult to get anything else established. So establishment time time of the year is critical. And in the northeast, you probably have a pretty short window as far as when there's snow on the ground to when the summer heat hits to get things established. So it's even more critical that you take advantage of that time and moisture to get the other things established. And picking what you want to put in there. So finding the legumes, overseeding legumes into grasses to white clover is a good one, and they will get into areas that the grass is bare, and they will try and fill in those spaces and hopefully reduce your weed population. But also you need to avoid overgrazing because while the legumes are getting established, if you have that flexibility. Do you think it is important to cut off weed tops? Yeah, it can certainly help. Actually, it can help your grass too. If you do inevitably end up losing control over the grass and it grows too long and the grass itself produces seed heads as well as weed, you can help that grass turn back into a vegetative state by topping off seed heads. If you remove the seed head from even a forage plant, it will it'll basically knock off that hormonal messaging to the plant to stop growing because it's completed its life cycle. So you kind of reset the plant. So yes, topping or mowing can be used effectively to restore grass to a sort of more vegetative, higher quality state, and in doing so will also reduce a lot of weeds. Most weeds, certainly broadleaf weeds, aren't as tolerant to mowing or grazing as grasses are, but that's because animals don't graze them. So the reason they're there is the animals leave them alone and let them grow. But if they are cut or even mechanically grazed like the grasses, typically they're not as resistant to that sort of treatment and will disappear in favour of the grass in the long run. Sorry, I'm trying to get to all these. I noticed some people will mow after they move their animals. Yeah, and I think that's just the same thing. They're just animals are selective, right? They don't graze uniformly. They'll go to areas of the field that are higher quality. I've measured in sheep actually eating different parts of the plant, not only different plants, but actually different parts of the plant. So they can be highly selective. And what that ends up is you get this mosaic of areas that are grazed more than others, which is important when you're making those sort of post-grazing targets, that you pick the areas that are being grazed, not the areas that are not being grazed. Animals will also avoid areas where they've defecated or areas where they camp, where they lie down, high nitrogen sites. They'll leave those areas and graze the other areas. So it can be useful to get in there and mow afterwards just to reset the field and get it all to a uniform leafy stand. So when it comes back the next time, it comes back more uniformly, because those big tall areas are going to grow back the same, and it's just going to exacerbate every time you graze. They're going to continually go back to the grazed areas and leave the long areas, and it just gets worse and worse until you top. Okay, Colby. Richard, could you speak more to the biotic stress concerns you mentioned earlier in your presentation? Yeah, so I mean, I think inevitably with changing climate and warming climate, you start to see species of insect or disease, whether it's viruses or fungal diseases, that are showing up in areas that they wouldn't have normally been there. So the biggest example I can use is again from the southeast here, is we are seeing fall armyworm earlier and in more abundance and more frequently than we've ever seen before. It's called the fall armyworm because it normally shows up in the fall. We got a massive outbreak of fall armyworm in June last year. So there's an example of a species that's, we typically see in the fall with moth flights showing up earlier than ever before. We're starting to see soybean rust coming from South America. So there's rust, there's mosaic viruses, there's insect species, all of which seem to be migrating north as things get warmer and more humid. And it's just something that we probably need to look out for in our pasture systems. All of a sudden, I mean, a good example is not necessarily from a forage production standpoint, is fire ants. There are a lot of species that are migrating north, where they're becoming more adapted to the cold, but I think they're just following the conditions. So it's just something we need to look out for. Mary, last year we had a burst of foxtail. Can we manage this with our grazing program? I think anytime you get an annual weed, particularly a summer annual, I sound like a broken record here, but I think the key here is just trying at all costs to try and avoid overgrazing. The more you overgraze, the more you open up the pasture to open up ground cover, give weeds an opportunity to establish, to germinate, and then to dominate. It's easier said than done, but I think trying to set yourself kind of targets and rules for late spring, early summer, and say, okay, I'm not going to overgraze the pasture. I'm going to leave enough cover, enough solid grass cover there that weeds aren't going to establish. The quality is going to be maintained, but also you're going to grow more grass that way too, even into the summer, because the more grass cover and ground cover you have going into the summer, the more that the ground is insulated. When you overgraze, you open up ground, sunlight hits the soil surface and heats the soil surface up, and exacerbates the ambient temperature. So the grass can handle higher ambient temperature if its roots and its growing point, the meristem, which is closest to the ground, is insulated by good ground cover. So I think it's just a matter of trying to set those targets for yourself and trying not to overgraze where you enter the summer with a healthy pasture. The pasture may shut down, but at least you're not going to get undesirable species in there, and it's set up in a better state to weather any climate extremes, any hot temperatures, and take advantage of rainfall. Did I miss one there? To protect soil, it's important to temporarily take animals off land when soil is wet. How do you monitor paddock wetness? Yeah, so a little bit to what I just said about sort of maintaining ground cover can certainly minimize that. Certainly if you can see hoof damage, and the crowns of the grass or the clovers are getting damaged. I think, again, with respect to how much space you have and how big your farm is and what opportunity you have, I would always try to establish what I would call sacrifice areas. It may be lanes, it may be wooded areas, where if you feel like you get a high rainfall event and there's a danger of damaging the pasture, you can put those animals temporarily with access to hay or water and keep them off the grass so they don't do any damage. Really, that depends on soil type. If you've got heavy clay soils, obviously it's going to take less of a rainfall event to result in damage versus a sandier, siltier soil which can drain better. But I would always have a contingency of areas to put animals during those sort of conditions, and during hot weather when maybe your animals don't want to graze, you can put them aside and put them under shade, and because they're not going to be grazing anyway, to avoid that overgrazing. The pasture damage aspect in a wet environment kind of is the same when you're trying to not overgraze too. You want to take the animals off and put them somewhere and not give them the next field that you're trying to slow that rotation down. So sacrifice areas are good. Might be lanes, you might have a corral, shaded corral, or tree line, or somewhere you can put them. These days, there's a lot of work being done on a thing called bale grazing, which you can Google. It's another way of slowing the round down and reducing the grazing pressure, as they literally will fence off or strip graze and put bales of hay already preset in the fields. So it's kind of like adding supplementary feeding in with the grazing rotation. Has the added impact of not just supplementary feeding, but also they distribute that hay and those nutrients to the rest of the field, and kind of acts as a bit of a nutrient recycling practice as well. I think that's all the questions.
Thank you, Richard, for taking the time to answer all those that came in. If anybody has anything last minute, certainly feel free to post it in the chat. Sarah, I just wanted to make sure that there's nothing that you have to add in to the conversation. Okay. All right. Well, I want